Thank you, Mark, for joining us today and lending your significant expertise to our podcast. We're going to ask if you'll give us an overview of our subject, which is how political parties choose their nominees, the delegate process, both on the Republican and the Democrat side, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. Let me first talk about the notion of how the process fits into the Constitution. And the answer is it doesn't. There is nothing in the Constitution about political parties. And there's nothing in the Constitution about political party conventions. During the drafting of the Constitution, there were a great deal of concerns expressed among the drafters on the notion of factions. And we would better understand factions now as political parties. They had a slightly different view of it. The reasons for that are pretty clear. They lacked a historical framework for what they were doing. The U.S. Constitution, in many ways, is this sort of original document that predates mass democracies, frankly, anywhere in the world. So they had little in the way of examples in other locations for the notion of a large mass democracy. So although they recognized the potential for factions because they existed in the Roman Republic and in the Greek predecessors, which are the closest that they were looking at, they really didn't see them or see the development or understand the development into what would become mass political organizations. In the sense of the terms, they would use sort of mass factions. So when the first president, Washington, effectively gets elected by acclamation. And then following his decision not to run for a third term, which of course there's nothing in the Constitution at that time that would have barred him from doing it. He would undoubtedly have been reelected again. We have the first situation where we have multiple candidates that are effectively chosen by the developing factions that came into existence then. We would see them, from our perspective looking back, we would identify them as really the first two American political parties, which would be the Federalist Party and the Democratic Party. They would at that time have called it the Democrat-Republican Party. So using those together would certainly confuse the discussion. So we have the first, and they were effectively, the candidates of the parties were effectively chosen by caucuses of the members of the House and Senate, and some political leaders from the state, but there was no meeting doing this except in a caucus situation in the process. So the first sort of contested situation and the party situation sort of are chosen in a more informal, small caucus process, sort of the old called King. At the time, they would have called it the King Caucus. So the meeting of the Federalists and the meetings of the Republican Democrats choosing the principal candidates. And then we don't see the development of a national meeting of these organizations, where initially informal coalitions of interest, until the 1830s. The only claim to fame of the anti-Masonic Party, shows you how politics change. There was something called the Anti-Masonic Party in 1830. They were the first party to have a national convention as stuff. The first national convention of something that we would recognize as a predecessor of our present political process is in 1832. Andrew Jackson has a national convention of the Democratic Party. Again, probably then still being called the Republican Democrat Party. And following that and Jackson's successful reelection, we see all the major political party organizations going to national conventions. These national conventions consist of a meeting called by some type of national organization of the party. At the time, we're talking about a variety of different parties. Democrat slash Republican Party has a continuing existence, arguably from Jackson to today, as a single organization. Our present Republican Party is a formation of arguably of the remnants of the Whig Party and break-offs over slavery disputes in the Democrats, etc. It's a much more fragmentized political situation. But we see these national conventions of the party leadership from each state coming in some formalized process with a formalized set of criteria and an actual meeting in one location, really starting there and moving forward. This process was, based upon each state providing a certain number of delegates very early on, based upon the size of the state and the size of the political parties in that state's success, but mirrored by some mathematical basis from the representation in Congress, in the Senate, and some representation of the success of that particular party in that particular geographic location. These are people that are chosen either ex officio because of the positions in the parties in the states, or based upon some caucusing or convention process in the states. There really are no public participation of the broader elector at this stage. We don't see any primary process into the latter part of the 19th century. The 19th century, you see the progressive and populist parties pushing for the creation of primaries, looking at a primary process that didn't really exist for any type of office into the late 1880s and 1890s. So pushed by the populists principally. So we have that's the first of the presidential primaries, but they are secondary parties in the process. So most of the delegates, really up until 1968, most of the delegates and most of the process is controlled through state caucuses or state party conventions. We do see primaries, and they have effect on who the delegates are and who, in a sense, and who the delegates support. But the primary process, really up until 1968, is more an influencing of how the delegates decide rather than controlling how the delegates vote. So you see this, as an example, you see this in 1952 as a perfect example. Stevenson's the Democratic nominee and runs in not a single Democratic primary. Didn't participate in any of them. You see some of the same thing with Hubert Humphrey being the nominee in 1968, where he effectively really didn't participate in the Democratic primary process. Besides myself, I don't think there's many people on sort of remember the 1968 convention on this phone, but that tended to be the process that changed how the delegates were chosen nationwide. And that's sort of the breaking point for the conventions, the actual who's there and how they vote, changing from sort of a convention process where people showed up and the decision was decided at the convention to a process where primary, not universally, but virtually universally, the various state primaries decide who the delegates are and how they vote. So have I used up all my time on this segment and ready for some questions? I can obviously go on for quite a long time babbling about the histories of the conventions. There's a lot of interesting notions of how it's changed. Obviously, the most important function is the selection of the candidates, the secondary function being the selection of a primary. But really, the people who are involved in this process, their desire is to create now a good TV show. And the conventions are basically TV productions trying to get a significant audience and using that audience to showcase both the nominee for both offices and various other leaders in the party. So what drives the process now principally is producing a nice, good-looking TV show, or maybe the way broadcast or whatever now, driving it to a much degree. I mean, we started the first TV broadcast, believe it or not, was in 1948, but you can probably count on your hands and toes the number of people who had TV that could see it. 52 is probably the first convention where TV played a big role. So,
Well, that's fascinating. And I mean, I've been involved in one way or another in politics almost all my life. And I have to say, I did not realize that our primary system is so young, actually. That's really fascinating. So, Janine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I have, I want to touch on two things. One is kind of outlining what you just said to recap for our younger students and kind of the understanding the process of even just, electing a president. But then I really want to flip to what's getting ready to happen, the Democratic convention, because this is unique. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, to jump ahead to modern day, in 1968, that's when LBJ pulled out.
yes.
He was pretty much the choice, and then he pulled out and said, he wasn't winning either. I'm not going to run for office. But then they didn't decide who was really going to be on the ticket until the convention, did they?
Yeah, that's largely the case. It was clear to most people before the convention that it would likely be Humphrey. But it certainly was not a done deal until he actually got nominated. And there were certainly a lot of people outside the convention halls in the streets of Chicago unhappy what appeared to be what was going to happen. But yes, after the first primary,
So,
Lyndon Johnson withdrew because the anti-war vote was much larger in the Democratic primary than he expected.
right. So he had won the primary, LBJ.
He
Correct?
did, yeah. He definitely won the New Hampshire
Okay.
primary by a substantial margin, but about 40%, which McGovern, I mean, not McGovern, but McCarthy got, I mean, maybe 28 or 30, 29, or maybe 39% of the vote, which shocked everyone. And that really started the collapse of political support for LBJ. Yeah, so it's a combination of the collapse of political support, and he had some health problems too, if truth be known.
Right. Okay. So, well, but in our instance, many primaries have voted for Biden, and then he dropped out. Are you saying only the New Hampshire primary had voted at that point?
At the time that Lyndon Johnson withdrew, you'd only had the New Hampshire primary. He withdrew following the political weakness shown in the New Hampshire primary. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Now there were still a lot of
that's my
primaries, and there was
recollection
a
is
big
that
fight over him. And Robert Kennedy won the California, and so there was a big primary battle between Kennedy and McCarthy across the country. And Humphrey only participated.
right. Okay. So LBJ pulled out, but then there was still a contention and a jockeying for who would win the other primaries, and then they really didn't know until the convention who the delegate was, who the presidential nominee was going to be.
That's correct.
So that's very
most
different than
of
what
them
we
weren't. Most of the delegates were not chosen through a primary process.
Right. So, but they didn't decide until they got to the actual convention, and that's why that there so many people unhappy. So now, if we jump to modern day and we have Kamala, it's like the reason so many people are concerned about it is the people really haven't had a say because they really voted for Biden. They didn't vote for her. And there's this presumption that she's the person, and yet they haven't had the convention yet. And supposedly, though, that's one of the reasons we wanted to do the show, is the delegates, so to speak, have said, "Oh, we pledge our to Kamala." So it's kind of unofficial. But I think that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, even though I'd love to go further back, but due to time. The delegates, describe what a delegate is. So, like, how many delegates per state? What is a delegate? And then the Democrats have super delegates. So, what are super delegates?
Well, superdelegates are effectively ex officio delegates. They become delegates principally based upon an other office they hold. So most of the ex officio delegates, which are about I think close to 750 ex officio delegates at the Democratic Convention. There's a total of almost 4,700 delegates at the convention. So 700, or I think it's about 750 are ex officio delegates effectively. They don't call them that. The terminology is super delegates, but they're basically delegates because they're a member of Congress, or they're a governor of the state, or they're chairman of the Democratic Party, or Democrat leader in the state Senate, or something. So they have it based upon their position. The other delegates are chosen through a variety of processes. Each state, on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, have state-specific processes for the choosing of delegates and how those delegates are pledged to vote. Sometimes those are linked together, and sometimes are actually separate processes. So you have, a process where in most cases, how the delegates are required to vote for president is determined principally in this election by who wins the primary in the state. Some states still have, some Democratic parties still have caucuses and some conventions, but it's overwhelmingly done through a presidential primary process. With the withdrawal of Biden as a candidate, all the delegates at the Democratic Convention are effectively free agents. In other words, how they vote on the nominee for president is totally within their personal discretion. So they can vote for anybody they want when they show up at the convention. They are a delegate with autonomy. If Biden had not withdrawn, then he would have been the Democratic nominee, even though there might have been many delegates who didn't want him for whatever reason, because they would have been bound by law and party rule to have voted for him.
So they're bound by law, whoever wins the primary in the state, to vote for that person.
Yes. Yeah, and
so now,
Democratic National Committee rules require that too. The rules of the committee.
Right. Yeah. Rules of the convention. Okay. And so now they're free agents, and they could technically vote for whoever they wanted.
Yes.
When does the super delegates, now the Republicans don't have super delegates. So
Yep.
So why do Democrats have super delegates?
Well, it's the sort of political history after the disaster, what was perceived as a disaster, the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. The Democratic Party created something called the McGovern-Fraser Commission to change the rules under how the Democratic Convention would be conducted and how delegates would be chosen. What a shock that after having to draw up the rules, George McGovern, who draws up the rules, becomes the nominee in 1972. Just coincidence, but the McGovern-Fraser Commission basically pushed the Democratic selection process almost exclusively into a primary process. Now, I will also point out to you that 68 rule changes by the DNC hugely affected the Republican Party delegate selection process also, because in that period, the Democratic Party controlled the vast majority of state legislatures. Most of the states complied with the Democratic rules by changing their processes over to primaries. The Republican Party's rules basically said, we're going to do it however the state law provides. So the changes enacted by the Democrats to create primaries in most states resulted in the Republican convention in 72 being a convention of almost all primary, not almost all, but a very high percentage of the delegates chosen through the primary process. And so the Republicans, in a sense, got pulled into the process and just followed in the wake of the Democrat McGovern-Fraser Commission.
That's a little bit confusing, but
Well,
not that you're
it
confused. It's just
certainly
the whole
is.
thing's confusing.
Yeah, it's the
But
interaction
but
between state law and party rule. And that's a very tricky legal issue as to which controls, but effectively the Republicans until recently deferred to whatever the state law was as to how the delegates should be chosen.
Okay, but what I'm still not really understanding, and forgive me, is, and I'm sure you said it and I just didn't catch it. Why did the Democrats create super delegates? Because we don't have them. The Republican Party doesn't have them. So why did they create them again? In like 5 seconds, because I'm running out of time.
Sure, it was a belief that there needed to be, shall we say, more stable leadership, and trying. The political decision certainly was based upon the notion that it would make more establishment candidates more likely to have a base of support at the convention. We basically say that the Republican convention doesn't have super delegates, but it sort of does. Each state has a member of the RNC is effectively a super delegate because they get to be a delegate at the convention based upon their position ex officio. So the political decision is to try to have more establishment role in the process and not purely.
But it seems to me that the super delegates kind of step on the democratic process, because if the people vote and send their delegates, and the super delegates can come in a kind of superior manner, like a king or a queen, and step on the will of the people, it seems kind of interesting. I find that whole process really interesting.
Well, that certainly is a reasonable way to characterize it. First of all, they're too small in number to, in fact, step on the will of the. I mean, the convention is really, both the Republican side and Democratic side, is effectively totally dominated by the primary process. They certainly could affect it if you had a divided situation, but that they're not large enough in number to sway if there is significant majority support for another candidate in the primary process. And
I also want to highlight that I believe in 2016, the Democratic Party instituted a rule that superdelegates actually can't vote on the first round of voting for nomination, so they can only vote basically after
they make a second ballot. That is correct.
Second ballot, and
yeah.
So it doesn't really affect the result anymore. To your point, Mark.
You're not going to see, unless you have a divided process, the nominee is going to be whoever wins in the primary, unless it's anyone who gets a majority of the primary delegates committed to them is going to be the nominee of either of the party. There just aren't enough sort of other ways to get to the table. Frankly, they were winning.
Well, that's certainly not the way you that's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really fascinating, both from a Democrat and Republican process. And lastly, I think I have about 6 seconds left, but it's just interesting how it switched from it being an open delegation convention where people made the decision at the convention to having it all wrapped up before. So, and I still think this whole Kamala thing is really interesting, just because the people really didn't get to vote for her. But in my last question for you, in 15 seconds to answer, so Tova can go. Is it do you like the process better where they elected the person at the convention? Or do you like it the way it is now, where it's just all wrapped up and it's just sort of like a gigantic TV show in 15 seconds?
I do not like the present process. It has not worked as well as the prior process, where there was more of a role for traditional political leaders. I probably put people's nose out of joint, but I would suggest that the quality of candidates measured by experience, let's put it that way, prior to 68 was demonstratively higher. Both parties' candidates, I think you can go back to the 40s and look at people who had more recognizable political leadership than the more recent candidates. Now, that doesn't mean all of them, and I'm not trying to shadow over anyone, but you get different types of candidates where there's a more significant role for local elected leaders. We have a more populist political process right now than we used to have. And in true confession, I am more of a traditional conservative Burkean type view of the world, which I'm not. And our founding fathers certainly were not. Would have been astounded at a process where the presidential campaigns were this sort of mass media, mass participation process. That certainly was not what we had in mind.
Well, that's why I wanted to start there, but I didn't have a chance to go all the way back. But anyway, okay, thank you, and I'm going to pass to Tova. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Janine, and thank you, Mark, for being on. I just wanted to start by, I guess, gently pushing back a little bit on
Sure.
the notion that kind of Kamala Harris was anointed as nominee for the Democratic Party. Because Mark, feel free to fill in if I'm wrong on any of these points, but my understanding is that the delegates voted through the primary process and voted for President Biden as nominee, and he stepped down. And I guess that's maybe one point you could argue about whether that was the influence of elites versus rank and file members, but he did voluntarily step down. And though he did endorse Kamala Harris as the new nominee, she did not unilaterally become nominee after he endorsed her. So actually what's currently happening right now, as we speak, is the Democratic Party has a filing process for nominee where anybody can submit their name to become nominee of the Democratic Party. And what they have to do is get 300 delegates from at least 5 different states. So, sorry, no more than 50 delegates can be from a single state. So it has to have 300 delegates. The vast majority, I think 99% were pledged to Biden. So basically it's a fight for President Biden's delegates. And these delegates, again, 300 across 5 states, no more than 50 from each state. But really anyone can run. It's almost certain that Vice President Harris will become the new nominee, but there is a process currently. And within a few days, that process will be closed. And anybody who reached the correct amount of signatures from delegates, there will be a ballot, the delegates will vote, and then the winner of that contest will become the nominee. So maybe some additional context that she wasn't unilaterally appointed.
Well, I will just step in. I'll just step in here and say, though, that there's not enough time for anybody to launch a real campaign against her now. It's so last minute that there's really not enough time to step in. I don't think there's really enough time to step in, is there? I mean, this last second business like this for any, I mean, how logical is it that someone can really go get signatures right now
So
and
respectfully,
could step
I
up against someone who's been anointed, so to speak?
So I respectfully, I think that's a valid like normative discussion on like whether there is enough time, but I think procedurally, when the nominee steps down, that's how you have to do it under the rules and bylaws. But Mark, interested to hear your opinion.
Sure. Well, I reject the characterization that you've been hearing of it being a coup. It is not a coup. And once Biden withdrew, the delegates were free agents. Now, certainly Biden endorsing her is a thumb on the scales, but she showed very substantial political acumen by going in and actually going out and talking to political leaders and talking to individual delegates. My understanding is she talked to individual delegates and got commitments from a majority of them on an individualized basis. If she lacked that skill, first of all, if she hadn't been endorsed by Biden, it seems very clear to me that there would have been an open convention, and it's not altogether clear that she would be the nominee. I think there were other people that would have run. Biden was, not surprisingly, endorsing someone who was that he chose to be the vice president. So I'm not surprising he thinks that she would be a good president. So sure, if Biden hadn't endorsed her, then it seems likely there would have been other Democratic candidates. But she did show significant political skills going out and getting the support. You might notice that probably the most popular figure or figures, let me do it plural, in the Democratic Party were the Obamas. And you notice they did not endorse her until after she already had a majority of the delegates publicly committed to her, really just for the reason to try to take the position that they weren't, at least I think, for the notion that they weren't trying to anoint her, and two, to see whether she had the political skills to do it. It's just Biden endorsing her didn't instantly get that level of support. She had to go out and convince people to do that. So
But I have a question. Do the delegates go back to all the people that voted in the primary and ask them who they want?
No.
I mean, that's, I think, the question too. I mean, do they go back to the millions of people that showed up in the primaries and say, is this Kamala Harris? Is this who you want? Or is the delegate just making that decision because they feel they have the right to make that decision? That's a question too. What if everybody had a chance to really vote again?
My ability to predict isn't very good on that issue, but leaving aside, did they have a right to do that? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. There's no question they had a right to do it. They had the right to do it the same way that the delegates who were elected to support Nikki Haley, she said, I'm withdrawing, and they all ended up voting for Donald Trump. They made an individual decision to vote for Donald Trump when she withdrew. Technically, they didn't have to. They could have voted for somebody else. So yeah, that's the sort of the process. You elect delegates, and you do in fact give them they are your delegates. So when you vote for them, you've anointed them individually with some decision-making process. So yeah, I mean, I understand there certainly probably many people who participated in the primary on the Democratic side who are not happy with her as a nominee, I'm sure. But it's a process, and I understand, but it's not as though it wasn't still a political process. Getting a majority committed of 4,700 people, who most of whom have some sort of political involvement and are most of whom are going to be relative sophisticated people. I don't have a process. It's frankly, my view is that it's good that they were able to get around having to nominate someone who was visibly unable to perform the job because of age. So,
And mhm. And to be clear, I don't believe that the Democratic Party could have held another primary. I don't think that that's allowed under
no,
party bylaws or law. So, you know, with what happened, with
sure.
the nominee dropping out, everything was conducted according to the rules and bylaws, to my knowledge. And then my question was on just, I guess we touched on this a little bit, but broad differences between the Democrat and the Republican parties. In this primary process, I know we touched on delegates versus superdelegates. I know that the Democratic Party has gender balance requirements among delegates. So that's another difference, whereas the
Sure.
Republican Party, to my own knowledge, doesn't. Are there any other broad differences that we need to mention?
Well, I mean, the Democratic convention is significantly larger than the Republican convention. The Republican convention deals with a set of rules generally that are in place for a 4-year period of time. The Democratic convention, although it deals with setting rules for the next convention, Democratic National Committee has authority to change those rules. So the RNC, the convention for the Republican Party, is more an event that sort of locks in place. It's an exaggeration to say lock in place, but is an attempt to set the rules for the next convention. Democratic convention is, should we say, substantially more malleable.
Interesting. And I mean, you've worked at the RNC over a number of cycles. Have there been any major efforts to update the delegate selection rules, or has it stayed pretty standard since the McGovern-Fraser Commission?
No, there's continuing efforts to change the rules all the time, because how you write the rules affects on who wins. So there's a never-ending effect. The rules process is twofold. You have the rules as expressed by the party committees, but you overlay those rules the state legislative and state party processes. So it's an interaction between the two sets of rules. So it's ongoing all the time, and every participant in the process is trying to change / manipulate the rules in a manner that serves their political interests.
That's how it goes.
Welcome to politics.
Right. Who knew political parties would be political? I'm shocked.
Well, thank you for delving into the very complicated territory of political parties in the US. I know that my understanding of the power of the parties themselves is limited at best, so listening to your opening statement was very informative. But I'm not sure if you answered some of this already, but the power that the parties have and the power that the parties give the delegates only comes from the parties themselves, or where does the muscle of the current two major political parties come from?
Well, you can start with the principle of organizations that are given ballot status. So political parties' principal power, leaving in a technical legal sense, comes from the fact that they are recognized as people who have the authority to put the names of their chosen candidates on the ballot. So it's ballot access in a technical sense provides them with the sort of recognizable party power. Obviously, there are numerous other ways to look at political power. The party provides the basis for the organization in the House and Senate, in the federal level, and almost universally, with the exception, I guess, of Nebraska, provides the basis for the structure and functioning of state legislative bodies and most legislative bodies at even lower levels. So the parties are recognized pursuant to state law, and basically it differs from state to state, but basically a party has ballot access in almost all the states, if their candidate for, say, governor in the last election was one of the two candidates who got the highest and second highest level of votes for the office. That's a common statutory definition of party ballot access. Again, there are 50 plus different flavors to that, but that's the principle.
And just to be clear for the listeners, and these parties are not governmental organizations, and they're not affiliated with the federal or state governments in a technical sense.
That is correct. They're not. The federal Constitution and federal statute don't recognize specifically a Republican Party or a Democratic Party. And at the state level, there's this they're indirectly recognized through the statutory ballot access process. And then they're informally recognized through the legislative process, through the majority leader and minority leaders. But that sometimes is a fluid process and don't always break down on totally by parties. So
Do you think that the political structure and the machinery that the parties have introduced into our government has been something that's an impediment to how our founders
no, I really don't.
have seen that our
I think
country would want to talk about on this.
I think our history and most democratic history of sort of Western style mass democracies effectively show that it's very difficult and probably impossible to have that type of functioning without some type of party organization that consolidates political views into digestible pieces for the electorate. So I know of no functioning Western style democracy that doesn't have political parties. And so now they've good things and bad things, and their power flows back and forth. But certainly it seems to be based upon experience that you really can't have a functioning democracy without something resembling party organizations.
Do you think that there's any, do you think in the way that our modern delegates act and vote and bring us our candidates, is there anything in that process which you've seen maybe this should be, changed or improved or thought differently about? Or do you think that the system we have right now I'm only talking about the delegates, that our system with the delegates and the candidates is pretty strong? As far as
no, I'm not particularly convinced that our present delegate selection process is pretty strong and works well. It's really more of a national primary process that's a little disjointed and whatever. I mean, I'll go back to another election back in 2016 and use some language from the speech I've given. There's a problem with a process that ends up nominating candidates that have negatives with the electorate in the mid-60s. That's what happened in 2016. And so that's a problem. That's a systematic problem. It's hard to say it's a good system when a majority of the electorate don't like the people who are the candidates of the party in the fall. I hate to wade into what's going on right now, but most polling data shows that the two presidential nominees are not particularly popular with a majority of the electorate, and they have unfavorable numbers, not 49-51, but they all have unfavorable numbers above 60. That's not a good situation. So is that just an unfortunate moment now? I don't know, but I'm tending to think it reflects the system not working particularly well.
You had mentioned also, sorry, I'm not commenting on your answers. They're all great answers. Hopefully, you
Oh,
don't. Not
please
I'm
do.
just moving on.
I'm not writing the gospel, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
but no, I'm very interested in the discussion, and hearing your answers. But another question. So, as far, you had mentioned that prior to, I think you had mentioned a date in the '60s, maybe, that our
Mhm.
candidates had far more experience.
Yeah,
Traditionally, candidates that came forward had at least been tested by experience, and then we see slightly different process. Maybe we could point to the TV as something, television or something like that, that made a political figure able to rise more so on strength of personality, and then
sure.
experience didn't. There probably is many political science papers written on that, but who knows? Whatever the reason is, um, there's a very popular talking point all about democracy, democracy, democracy. There's even split upon party lines somewhat, where are we a democracy or a republic? That's covered, of course, in on this show and many other places. But do you think that our primary focus is different than our founders when we look for the democratic process as our end goal, as in each person getting the person that they want to be the candidate? Or do you think that that is what our focus should be as we look at our delegate system? So thinking about, the way that the Senate used to be, you're thinking about our different processes that used to be uh, more like a republic. So do you think that as we look for democracy, look for people's vote, selecting the candidate they want, do you think that that impetus is it keeping in line with the spirit of the country that was founded, or do you think it's a change? And I have no idea what your answer will be to that.
The answer, the one that you can partially answer pretty simply, which is it's not in keeping with the views of this mass democracy, is not in keeping with the views of the original drafters of the Constitution. They had an electoral college for a reason. They had a Senate process that was not sort of a mass democracy project. So I think it's clear that the drafters of the US Constitution had some problems with, and they were concerned about uh, the, the sort of demagogue argument that a mass democracy that was direct would be unduly influenced by the passions of that time. I think historically that's pretty much undeniable. That changes with really to a large degree with Andrew Jackson, and certainly there's something of a dispute between the Thomas Jeffersons of the world and the Adams in the world. But as you might not remember, Jefferson did not participate in drafting of the Constitution. He was over in Paris, not at the Olympics, but at other events. So little revolution. So certainly their views, but this is also a group of men who, women didn't vote. There were, at least in some of the states, property requirements, and certainly in the vast majority of the states, African Americans didn't vote, enslaved persons didn't vote. So that there certainly were, it's a different world now than then, and which requires different different sort of projects going forward. Historically, they would not be comfortable with the degree of direct participation in the process. If I had a great solution of how to balance those, then I would be a philosopher rather than just a lawyer. So,
Great answer. Thank you very much. And pass to Kathy for any closing show questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jewel. And we've had a great discussion today and lots of interest from our audience. Before I get to the audience questions, I want to recognize our students and teachers who are here with us today. We have D'Angela Hines with 13 students from Emerald Coast Christian Academy. So we welcome D'Angela and all her students. And we also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial in Las Vegas. Thank you for listening to Constituting America's live Constitutional Chats podcast, broadcast Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Las Vegas or Pacific time. So we probably have time for at least one question. I want to get to Professor Klinger, who asks, political parties as organizations have some First Amendment protections, but state governments have imposed significant regulations on parties under their constitutional role in administering elections. Can Mr. Braden discuss this tension with respect to open, he says open CF period, closed primaries, I'm not sure what that means, or candidate ballot access issues?
Sure. That there's a whole line of litigation and cases on these issues. And it's a very complicated jurisprudence. Certainly, there's no question that party committees have First Amendment rights, both associational rights, but they intersect with the Constitution in a variety of different ways. And there's thousands of pages of litigation over attempts to regulate campaign finance and to regulate the fundraising of political party organizations. There have been some litigation and experience that you can go back to the white primary cases, which I would argue the associational rights there were overcome by the Civil War, effectively the 15th Amendment. So it's clearly constitutional to limit racial or ethnic discrimination in a primary process. And the Voting Rights Act does that too. And that probably is based upon the amendments. But most of the associational rights, more recently, the court's given probably more deference to the party committees getting to decide their structures and how. So constitutionally, the parties can probably opt out from the process as to how to principally opt out of the process and supersede state law if they want to, or they decide to do that. Again, there's a lot of deference in the party rules to state processes, but if the Republican Party were to pass a rule saying they could do it, which they've got partially have done, they can in fact probably do it under some of the most recent jurisprudence from the court.
Well, thank you. And we are just right at the top of the hour. I want to close out with a comment from Teresa Speak in California. And Teresa says, wow, this was so great, especially the last discussion about democratic representation in the delegate and nominating process. So Mark, thank you. I just can't think of a better guest than we could have had today than you. You're so knowledgeable on so many aspects of both election law and how both political parties operate. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
I don't know if it was wisdom, but thank you for inviting me.
It was wisdom and knowledge. So we want to thank our audience for being with us today. And we're sorry we didn't get to more of your audience questions, but we thank you so much for participating. And we invite you back next week when we're going to do one more look at one more Supreme Court decision, the SEC versus Jharkhasi, where they have really dialed back the power of these administrative law courts within the SEC and possibly having a further impact with administrative law judges. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody back next week. Thank you.